Good afternoon, and welcome to Delayed After Dark, a true crime podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Orion.
I'm your other host, Ducky. For our first episode, we figured we'd talk about the first serial killer that is documented, pretty much. Yeah.
Fellow's name is Gilles de Rais. He is the first serial killer in recorded history. He is one of the reasons that there needed to be some type of new term for someone who was a multiple time criminal.
Yeah, so he was originally born in, what was it, 1409?
1404, actually.
Okay, so he was born in 1404, but he was born into a pretty noble family, pretty rich family, in France. He was a member of the Christian church from birth. Um,
He was well received by the church too when he was born. He was christened shortly after his birth, and he was a very well educated and intelligent young man.
He was well educated, but it seemed like that later on in his life kind of kicked him in the ass because as much as he was well educated and they spent a lot of money on his education, he didn't actually retain a lot of that when growing up because he instead wanted to focus on being a military leader with his family being such a high-ranking members in society.
You make a good point there because from some of the research that we have done, I actually discovered that most of the education that he retained was his fluency in Latin and his serious love for the arts. He was considered a great patron of the arts.
Yeah, later in his life, he actually collected a bunch of different art pieces, and that it comes into a lot with later on his spending problem that he gets as a adult whenever he starts into his lower points in his life.
The unfortunate part is that he did have some tragedy that befell him during childhood. Starting from a very young age, he was 10 years old when his dad was killed during an incident with a boar.
Yeah, his mother died shortly after that as well. She was not too far behind. I think it was like 3 months or something like that, where both of his parents were taken from him. And then he went to go live with his grandfather, who became his primary caretaker. And his grandfather wasn't the best person, but as he grew up, his grandfather became one of the biggest influences in his life. And he looked up to him.
So it's important to know as well that it was not just Gilles de Rais, our very first ever recorded serial killer, that was living with the maternal grandfather. It was also his younger brother, Rene. So that could have easily contributed to any problems that Gilles had between himself and his maternal grandfather, Jean de Crayon.
Yeah, so his brother is really like not mentioned a lot whenever you look into his backstory into his life because he was anywhere from 5 years to 10 years younger than him and wasn't really part of his life growing up. Like they were very estranged growing up, and it wasn't really a big part of his life, which like you said kind of could play into his trauma to where he had this estranged brother that he really didn't know, so he kind of grew up an only child, so the spotlight was kind of on him the whole time, so he probably had a lot to do with his stress growing up.
And a big part of the problem dealing with all that stress on top of that is that, you know, De Crayon, he was a really greedy and immoral guy. He was just not a good person. He only adopted Gilles and Renee so that he could increase his own wealth. So much to the fact that he tried to marry Gilles off to a rich orphan that lived in Normandy when she was only 4 years old and there was no actual wedding.
Yeah, so his grandfather was very, very greedy. Like it comes back again later in his life, right before he passes away, that he owned a lot of France. And that's where John V comes into play, where he didn't want Gilles de Rais' grandfather didn't want John V to have all this land. So later in life, as Gilles de Rais kind of does what he ends up doing, his grandfather is there kind of pissed off the entire time because he's selling them to John V. Like he's selling a lot of the land that he inherits to John V for money.
We can link that right back to the fact that he very specifically pushed Gilles at 16 years old to marry the heiress Catherine the Taurus, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, of Brittany,
Yeah, that's his
specifically
fourth
because he
cousin.
wanted her money.
Yeah, that's his fourth cousin actually. So he went and Gilles went and kidnapped his fourth cousin and was forced to marry her at 14. However, the marriage was considered null and void because she really didn't consent to it. But what Gilles and his grandfather ended up doing was basically playing politics to where it ended up going through anyway. And as much as he went and married this woman and like was forced to, Gilles did not show any interest in women at all. Like he didn't talk about his wife at all. They only had, I think it was one kid or two kids. He's like throughout his life he was very like away from his wife. Like he wanted absolutely
To
nothing to
the
do with
point
her, it seemed
where
like.
that is to the point where it's even suspected that he was a homosexual that had to keep that homosexuality under wraps because of the time period that he lived in. He could have been persecuted or even killed for trying to maintain a relationship with another man.
Yeah. Yeah, so he just like really was against it. So after that is when he like there's a big like gap in his life where not a lot happened after that. But he started focusing a lot on his military prowess and becoming a very noble leader. And by the sounds of it, what his men were talking about, they really were very loyal to him because he paid them well, fed them well, and he spent a lot of money on them. So it was pretty easy to keep their loyalty and to keep them with him, is what it seems like.
Did you know that one of the reasons that he originally joined the military was because his family was a noble family and he felt like he had an inherent duty to protect the kingdom and support the king?
I did not know that actually. I didn't find that in much of the research that I was looking for.
Um,
Um,
when I was looking at the research, I was seeing that, he did have an interest in military strategy and being in the military when he was young. But one of his main contributing factors to him joining the military is he felt like that because he was part of a noble family, especially a noble family that was dealing with a lot of expenditures because Jean de Craon, his grandfather, was spending a lot of money and buying things that were far more lavish than even the king himself owned. He felt like he had a duty to country to serve and support the king.
that's probably where a lot of his spending problem came from as well, is his grandfather. But the one thing that his grandfather was also good at doing was making money. Gilles de Rais, he was spending a lot of money, but he wasn't gaining much in return. So he was spending a lot of money on his army and on himself and on like lavish things. And that really put a big wedge between him and his grandfather later on down the line whenever he like after he goes to war with Joan of Arc, him and his grandfather start having a lot of problems because of how much money he actually spends and how much he takes in.
And that's one thing that I really want to make sure that we touch on as well is that he had a lot of closeness and serve time with Joan of Arc. He actually came into involvement with the Hundred-Year War between France and England over the rule of France when his home in Brittany became contested territory.
Yeah, yeah. So he worked a lot with Joan of Arc throughout her time. It wasn't up until she was executed for heresy that he really stopped working with her. But from what I found, he hated working with her. Like absolutely hated it because he described her as very hot-headed. So she would like she got attacked one night, and instead of going and making sure that she had a plan, she grabbed like a bunch of undertrained soldiers and just try to go to town and kill some people, like killed whoever killed him or whoever attacked her. And Gilles de Rais had to bail her out of a lot.
You
So
make a
she
good
got a
point
lot
there.
of credit.
When Joan of Arc originally joined the war, Gilles de Rais was actually tasked with watching over her and like being her keeper. And I'm sure that led to a lot of resentment because she was not a strategic and skilled fighter in the same way that he was. He was impulsive, but he was also passionate, competent, and fearless. He was good military personnel, whereas Joan of Arc, when he was tasked with basically babysitting her, became a big problem for him because she did not have the strategy, the knowledge, and the
Yeah.
competency to be able to do the things that she was trying to do. But because of some of the things that he did as military personnel, he was able to become the Marshal of France at just 24 years old.
Yeah, so him and Joan of Arc have kind of a rough relationship, but historians see that they are close enough together to where later on, whenever they were re-looking at these two cases, her being charged with heresy and all of the murders that Gilles de Rais admitted to, they intertwine them enough to where if they say if one's guilty, then the other one's guilty, or if one's innocent, then the other one's innocent. So that is like the big like thing between these two is that they are just so intertwined during the Hundred Years' War that if they, one's guilty, the other one's guilty. However, Joan of Arc did have a problem with Gilles de Rais because during one of their battles afterwards, Gilles de Rais went and executed a bunch of French officers and let a bunch of English officers live that they had captured. This is where some people say it's their first sign of the his declined mental state. Other people say it was just to make a political statement. So that is where people start looking into whether or not he was actually going down the killer path or if he was just trying to make a political statement in this giant war.
And it's crazy that that is the way that things had to go for them, because after Joan's capture and execution during her trial, that's when DeRay became more known for his lavish lifestyle. And it kind of seems like, if you look at it from that point of view, that he had some type of trauma response to Joan's capture, trial, and execution that made him want to live in a lavish way. Like, he was concerned that because she had been captured and executed, that he was next because of their association. He even sold family land when his debt became too great. Like you mentioned, he wanted more money. He was selling off pieces of family land and really irritating and pissing off his family. And he became uncontrollable with his money when Jean de Craon, his grandfather, passed away.
Yeah, so once his grandfather passed away, in the trials that we'll talk about later, he admitted to that is when most of the killing started. That is when he started kidnapping and killing the children of the surrounding area. But he was spending a lot of money selling a lot of his land to try to keep up with that. And on top of that, he was trying to maintain his army. So he wasn't quite out of the military scene whenever his grandfather passed. He was still fighting in a few battles. With his last battle, he admitted to killing up to, I think it was like 10 to 15 kids at that point.
Which is wild, because when you look at some of the things that happened around similar times, such as when he had his come to Jesus moment, if that's what you want to call it, he started dedicating himself to religion, which isn't necessarily as good as some people might think that it was. He requested permission from the diocese to build a church and have it be entered into official Catholic diocese on his private lands, and he was denied that entry because of the fact that he had some type of craziness going on with him, where he thought that he should be the one to handle all of the business with the church. He should be preaching and doing the sermons and taking confessions and things like that. And at the same time that he was doing those things, he was already allegedly kidnapping children and murdering them. He was
Yeah,
spending
so
lots of money to do this as well.
yeah, so he has a really rocky relationship with the church throughout his life. He would like dive into it, he'd back out of it, and it was just really back and forth. Where sometimes he'd have these really like you said, come to Jesus moments where he would be really into the church, he'd want to do a bunch of things, and then all of a sudden he'd disappear from public light. Um, and eventually, after his grandfather passed and he stepped out of the military scene, he started spending a lot of money putting on plays where it was like
But
I
there is
think it
one
was like
thing that we
three
missed
months.
before that. There is one thing that we missed before that. The church that
What's
he
that?
was trying to get entered into, the Catholic diocese, was called the Chapel of the Innocents.
Hmm.
And it had a huge
Okay.
choir of young boys that were handpicked by Gilles de Rais himself and would regularly go missing. Parents would send their
Yes.
children to stay with him at his home and on his lands so that they could be a portion of this choir. And then they wouldn't hear from their children for months thereafter.
So that's also something that comes into play whenever he was on trial. It turns out that he would hire or manipulate some of these older boys who were in the choir to lure the younger boys away, or just kids in general, younger kids, and lure them away so he could kill them and then do whatever he was doing with them. So that's the thing. There's no like hard evidence to say that he killed these kids, and there's no evidence to say what he did before killing these kids.
As far as the
Um,
research that I looked at, it stated that there were several employed members of the household that were like servants and butlers and things of that nature
yes.
that made statements later on in his trial that they had taken bodies or even pieces of bodies and burned them in the home's fireplaces.
Yes.
But we can't be sure whether or
Yes.
not that's 100% fact, because at that point they could have been being swayed or influenced by anything and just trying to join the sensationalism by stating this is what we did. It's all hearsay.
Yeah, so that is the big thing, is a lot of what happened in this trial, and why later on in the 90s he was founded to be acquitted on all of his charges, because there was really no evidence besides hearsay evidence and circumstantial evidence. So he went and had this choir. He had two of his cousins actually helping him. He had an older lady who would roam the countryside and take kids in. So he had a bunch of people helping him. He had two servants, two cousins, and the choir boys, and a older lady who would just take in as many kids as they could. And he started getting really depressed at the beginning, shortly after he left like the military scene. After he started having like little to no public relations, he started getting really depressed and into alcoholism, and his spending problems kept getting worse and worse. Like I mentioned earlier, how there was the play that he would put on where everybody who was in the play never wore the same outfit twice. He had a bunch of stained glass, a bunch of art hung up in his castles, to where he was spending all this money, and his castles were also publicly available. I don't know if you saw that.
I did not see that, but I did see that the specific reason that he spent so much money to create this acting troupe, which had over 600 members, was to relive his battles from when he was in the
Yes.
military. He had some type of obsession. He was providing lavish costumes that were thrown out after one use, and new ones were made for future performances. That's a lot of money. He also paid for and provided food and drink to convince other people to come and watch his plays. He sold
Yes.
his wife's jewelry and some family property to pay debts that were incurred by the troupe, and ended up with his family petitioning the Pope to control his spending. And the Pope was like, nah, I'm not getting involved here. So they had a royal decree put in place to stop him from selling family properties to continue to pay off his debts for his very lavish acting troupe.
Yes. And the big thing is he was taking out loans from other countries, or not other countries, but other leaders, and just pretty much like he owed everybody money before he passed. He was spending way more than he was taking in. He was, like you said, he was selling property, selling jewelry, he was selling family estates, and he was taking out loans to try to pay off these debts. He also, as he started going into his alcoholism and depression, he allegedly got into demon summoning and alchemy.
Alchemy. So at that point,
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. At that point where he was dealing with a lot of the financial problems and he was getting cut off from that family money and those family properties, he did turn to alchemy for financial help. He employed people who were considered sorcerers and alchemists. A couple of nefarious men that were involved were the priest Eustache Blanchett and the cleric Francesco Prelate, who was supposedly able to
Yes.
conjure demons that he could offer sacrifice to for financial gain.
Yes. And he did go to the thing with
Francesco.
Francesco, he was a scam artist. Like he was well known for being a scam artist. And there was one point where Gilles was pretty well down bad. He came to him and he was like, "Hey, I need money." So he's like, "Hey, this demon is going to give you money," right? So he summoned this demon and he's like, "All right, Gilles, look at this, look through a crack in this door. You'll see your money, but you can't have it yet," right? Gilles looks through the crack in the door to see the gold, and he loses his mind. So he kicks in the door and goes to look at the money. The money is fake. All of it's fake gold. Instead of blaming the alchemist, he instead blamed the demon. He said that
Right,
the demon was trying to scam him.
the demon's actual name is Baron. and they tried to
Yes.
summon him 3 separate times. And because there was no manifestation within those 3 attempts, Prelate insisted that children's body parts were going to be needed for sacrifice to summon Baron so that they could gain this wealth. And that led to Duray actually providing body parts from children in some type of glass container, which at this point there are many different opinions on what happened, whether or not he killed children himself or whether he robbed from a local mortuary, because in a glass container at that point in time it probably would have been like a glass jar that they would have held organs in during the mortuary process to prepare
Yes.
a child for burial, and the summoning
Yes.
still didn't work after that.
Yes, and with how public his castles were, this is where the evidence starts getting a little weary because everyone's saying that he brought them to the castles and murdered these children. However, there's no really evidence to support that because his castles were open to the public. So with everybody going in, no one ever reported anything strange in there. No one ever reported any smells and stuff like that. However, we have seen it in modern day with John Wayne Gacy, where people can hide remains in very small places and people not find it. So,
And when the children started to go missing, like regularly going missing in the areas surrounding Gilles' castle, rumors started spreading that he had pleasure rooms at all of his estates that he would take these children to. And the
yes,
townspeople started believing that the disappearances and the impropriety of the pleasure rooms were connected because of, like we mentioned previously, many children went into Gilles' residence and they never left.
yes. And when these rumors started going around to, hey, kids are missing, hey, we think it's him, right? Because they're going to his castle, they're coming to his door, and they're going missing. There was
And that was
um
actually connected with people
yes,
assuming that they were being abducted and then assaulted in the pleasure rooms at Gilles' estates.
yes. And this got word to John V, right? Who was a fellow I think he's a king. I I didn't put that in my notes, unfortunately, but I think he was a king. And he hired someone to investigate into Jill's life, basically going to his castle, trying to figure stuff out, talk to people, basically just going to investigate what the hell is going on and why are these kids going missing.
And this leads to later on having the testimony from several bodyguards that children were being hung by ropes, being tortured, decapitated, and dismembered. And like I mentioned previously, that servants were burning bodies in the fireplace. They alleged that between 80 and 200 victims were taken, ranging in ages from 7 years old to 20.
Yes, but the thing is that leads into later whenever people were discussing on whether or not he did it, is the body count for how many people that he killed is just incredibly inconsistent. I saw anywhere from like 80 people to 120 people, which when you're talking about like actual bodies,
That's a lot of
you
bodies.
can't, that's a lot, right? And the fact that that number is so inconsistent leads into some of the theories later that we'll get into a little bit later.
It was common, though, that most of the families that were having missing children were young page boys. It was common for them to go to these estates and get gainful employment, do training and stuff like that to become young men. So these families were like not even wondering or worrying about what was happening with their children once they were taken in, until rumors started flying about mistreatment of the page boys and Duray's alleged predilections of child SA.
Yes.
The
And the
families
amount
were
of
originally
like,
told that the children were taken by the English, and their low social standing made it hard for them to be able to speak out about it.
yes. And so whenever these rumors actually started flying, and at this point people noticed that Gilles de Rais was pretty much completely absent from the public eye. He was never really seen. He was always in his castles, and people were taking the kids to him, right? And with these rumors flying and all that, Louis the 11th kidnapped one of Gilles's men, one of the people that were still working for him, as a warning to like a hey, we're kind of onto you, dude. and you should probably stop.
Which would make perfect sense because it was well known that Gilles was a military man. So
Yes.
one of his men going missing under somebody else's care or in somebody else's chains or bonds or dungeon, whatever it might have been at that point in time, would have been something that was very heartbreaking to him. It would have been something that really caught his attention for some type of communication to happen between Gilles and other people that, hey, we're on to you and this is how we're going to show you. We're going to take one of your men so you can see how it feels like so that you know that we know.
Yeah. Yeah. And also around that point, Jill was alleged to have admitted to what he was doing to a priest. And he like went into the confessional, basically said, "Hey, I have done these fucking heinous acts, and I promise I'm going to take a pilgrimage to the Holy Land to clean
He
his soul." Is
also
pretty much what he had said.
he also was
But he
arrested
never
for
did.
that later on because he was arrested because of that incident later on because he was accused of allegedly kidnapping the church member after a dispute from that situation.
Yes. So
The
yeah,
church
he
originally launched the investigation to start seeking evidence of his crimes.
yes, they were looking for evidence, and he had already like admitted to it there. He admits to these crimes like at least 14 times. And this time he was just like, "Hey, I'm gonna go take this pilgrimage to the Holy Land. I'm gonna clean my soul." And then he never did. Um, and then a few weeks later, after that, he sold one of his castles to John V. No, that's my bad. He had took back a castle that had taken from John V that he had sold to him earlier in life, and lined up about 60 soldiers around the castle, walked in, kidnapped John V's brother, and forced him to give him the keys to the castle. Basically, just
Rude.
came in with his men and took it back. And John V didn't like this at all, and he took it very personally, as he should have.
As he should, because that is rude. So, with that being the situation that Gilles was in, and that he went in and he took this place back over, where did he go from there that led to him ending up being charged with sodomy, heresy, and murder by both civil and ecclesiastic or church courts?
So through there, whenever he took John V's castle, John V, as we've discussed earlier, he was already suspicious and has already launched an investigation on this, right? Well, now that his brother has been taken, he's like, "All right, dude, I'm gonna launch more. I'm gonna do another investigation," and he collected a bunch of evidence, right? After he gets all of this evidence pointing to, hey, he did these crimes. He then sends a bunch of people to go arrest Jill and his servants, right? He also tried to go arrest his cousins, which were in the loop of people kidnapping, but his cousins skipped town and then were never found. So they were also a big part of this, but got out of it because they skipped town. Um,
And the servants
but
actually admitted to seeking out and stealing young boys for him to molest and then murder. Two
yes,
French
he
priests actually testified to his obsession with the occult and stated he used children's limbs in his dark arts rituals.
yes, yeah. So all the servants admitted to it, but this is where things get kind of
Hinky.
iffy because back then it was a lot of, we either give us the information we want or we're going to torture you, right?
Right.
So the one of the theories is that nothing that was admitted actually happened the way that they said it happened. What happened was the court systems went and basically tortured these people to get the answer that they wanted to hear so they could put it in the testimony to basically say, "Hey, you're guilty, these guys are guilty," and put them away, right?
And right
Because if
alongside
this
that
is,
same thinking, Rais himself claimed innocence from these crimes and was threatened with torture and excommunication from the church. So that could explain a lot to what happened quickly thereafter.
Yeah. So with this starts his trial, right? They found him, they've arrested him, they start this trial. Gilles was very cooperative at first. He was very pleasant, and he basically was working with the courts. Even though a bunch of people were testifying against him, he was working with the courts. Then they put him in jail for 3 weeks, right? While they basically sift through the evidence, they got statements, all of that. During that 3 weeks, no one knows what happened. But next time they brought him out into the courtroom, he was belligerent. He was insulting the judge. He was basically just going out. He was freaking out. He was outraged. He refused to take an oath that would have started the formal trial, right? But they started the trial anyway without him giving the oath that they needed, right? So they start this
So
trial, but
like
they
is that
immediately throw him back in
basically,
jail.
is that like a similar thing to like would have been that time frame's like whole Miranda rights type of deal? Like he would have had to make this statement to start the trial as if nowadays you have to have your Miranda rights read to you before you can be arrested.
Kind of. That's what they made it seem like. Whereas that this was like, hey, you basically swearing that you're gonna tell us what we want to know, but you don't have the right to remain silent. You have to answer these questions type ordeal. But he refused to do that. So they threw him back in jail for 2 days. And again, no one knows what happened in that 2 days, but as soon as they brought him back out, he was cooperative. He was asking for forgiveness, and he admitted to everything at this point except for the demon summoning. But he
Said
was
that
asking,
he was so devout that something must have happened church related because he was so
yes,
devout. He ended up confessing to the murders of the missing people and several other offenses at that time.
yes, yeah, he admitted to everything that everyone thought he did except for the demon summoning. He was like, didn't do that. But then again, this is also where people are starting to think, well, did he actually do these things or were they tortured out of him? Because again, oh, he was gone for 2 days. No one knows what happens in that 2 days, but now he's all of a sudden cooperative with the courts, right? So, and then you admit to everything except for demon summoning. Meanwhile, Jill's servants admitted to literally everything. They already said, hey, yes, we did this. We're pieces of garbage. There's nothing that we could do, right? But after he admitted to everything, he then goes on to refuse to answer any questions. So the courts gave him pretty much this ultimatum: we're going to torture the answers out of you, or you just tell us what we want to know, right? You have pretty much these two options, right? And then he was like, nah, I'd rather be tortured. And then when they brought him to the castle to get tortured, he was like, hey, instead of torturing me, I'll just tell you what you want to know. And then he wants to get admitted to everything. This is the third time he's admitted to killing these kids. But then when he asked why he did it, he said it was just because of his messed up imagination from when he was a child and as he was growing up, his messed up upbringing. That is
Well,
how.
he did have a pretty messed up upbringing. Jean de Crayon was not a good dude, and he really treated Gilles and his way lesser known younger brother Rene like absolute garbage. The only reason he wanted those boys anywhere near his estates is so that he could have access to their money.
Nope. Yeah, so his younger brother kind of like estranged, just not really there. But at this point in time in history, there wasn't a concept for a serial killer. So the judge, he was like trying to explain to them, hey, I'm just doing this because of my own imagination. And the judges and the courts were like, hey, that doesn't make sense. So they're kind of like picking at his brain, wanting to know more, but he can only explain so far. And then Francisco also testified and said that, hey, we did a ritual. So at this point, he hadn't really admitted to demon summoning, but he was like, yeah, we did a ritual to summon a demon, but only one time was a kid killed for that because that was one of his charges was killing kids for demon summoning. Um, and the alchemist pretty much said, no, we only did that. He only brought me remains one time. Yeah. And then The
And
day
that's why we
after
don't
that,
know whether or not that's a nefarious situation because we don't know how he got his hands on those remains. Bringing them
yeah,
specifically to the situation in a glass jar leads me to believe that they were stolen from a mortuary where a body was getting prepped for burial.
yes. And then after that, so he was kept in like this tower type cell area, and the judges came to him and pretty much said, like, Gilles confessed again. This is the fourth time he's confessed, and that is that's pretty much this is the funny part that he confessed and he was there. He was they were basically like, hey, we're just gonna kill you. Like at this point, he has got the death penalty. But when they were walking up to him about to die, he was giving a speech and trying to give out parenting advice. Funnily enough,
Which
he
is
basically,
wild because he didn't really have a leg to stand on to give any type of parenting
yeah,
advice, especially with the types of crimes that he was being accused of and had at that point was
admitted
convicted
to.
of murder and heresy and was sentenced to death.
Yeah. So he was convicted of killing these kids, and his own kids he didn't really even take care of. So he he was trying to give parenting advice and basically saying, "Hey, if you don't want your kids to end up like me, don't do this." Right? So
I mean, I guess that's
that's
kind of one way to say it.
yeah, that's pretty much exactly what he was saying. But although he did admit to all of his crimes, he never accepted fault for him. So he pretty much said, "Yeah, I did that, but it's not my fault I did it." Um,
Although
yeah,
there is other information that is kind of lesser known information when doing the research on DeRay himself. Yes, he was hanged and burned on October 4th of 1440, which would make him just a little bit older than I am now, but we're not going to say how old unless you want to go do the research yourself. But because he had confessed, and at that point he had completed several acts of contrition, he ended up being escorted to his execution by a bishop, and the crowd was
yes,
chanting prayers for his soul while he's trying to scream out parenting advice for from someone who is a convicted of murdering children after sodomy and molestation and whatnot. He's trying to give out parenting advice while the crowd is chanting prayers for him, and he's being escorted
yes,
by a bishop. He was supposed to have been contrite by this point and have been completely in the understanding that he was admitting to and remorseful of the acts that he had committed.
yes. So right before his execution, he had pretty much another come to Jesus moment. So this is him coming back to the church, and he pretty much accepted everything, but he wanted to rejoin the church. So they allowed him to rejoin the church um, due to his cooperation. In exchange, they said his body is not going to be burned to ash, but instead to touch the flame and to be given a Christian burial. And he also wanted to be burned first. He wanted to be executed first. The reason for this is because him and his servants were going to be killed together. Him and his two servants were going to be killed together. He requested to be to be killed first. That way, they saw that he got killed as well, and that he wasn't going to escape punishment just because of his high stature in
So
society.
that their last memories of the end of their life they could see and be of the understanding that he had
Yes,
accepted the punishment for his crimes, and that in itself could
yes,
be considered an act of contrition.
yes, and he like even in his last moments, he was still seen as somewhat of a noble person because of that. That he chose to die him first himself. That way, everyone knew that the like ringleader in quotation marks was dead, and his servants could see that he was punished, and it wasn't just them getting the shit end of the stick.
And he was
So
still a
he was
popular
just
dude.
yes, he was still very popular, and it was still very up in the air whether or not he did it, even though he admitted to it and he was convicted. But he personally was not burned. He was lowered to the flame, brought up, and given a Christian burial, while his two servants were burned to ash because they did not rejoin the church. So this brings up the question: was he innocent? Because back in
Before we
1992,
touch the question of whether or not he's innocent, I just want to throw another cool little factoid in there. And I don't know if you would think it's cool, but I kind of like it tickles my brain a little bit to think about. His death anniversary would subsequently be commemorated and celebrated by the people who were still like fans of his. They would commemorate it by whipping their children on the anniversary of his death.
I didn't know that. That's kind of a weird. That's kind of a weird thing.
It is
I didn't
really
know that.
weird. His death anniversary was celebrated for a long time by being a day where parents would openly beat the living crap out of their kids in honor of this dude who supposedly molested, raped, sodomized, and killed all these kids. What sense does that make?
It doesn't make any, at least in my opinion. So this brings up the question, was he innocent? Because back in 1992, there was an informal retrial where he was acquitted of all of his crimes. Now, it was actually a while before this. I think it was back in like the 1880s. There was another trial held for Joan of Arc. She was also acquitted on all of her charges of heresy. And then back in 1992, he was acquitted. The reason for that was because Joan of Arc, like I said at the beginning, they were so entwined in history where historians believed if one was guilty, then the other one was guilty. But since Joan of Arc was found innocent, or acquitted at least,
Gilles de
so
Rais was then
they had,
retried and found
yes,
innocent of his crimes.
yes. And there have been many authors that have made books on this of, hey, this is why I don't think that he was innocent, or I don't think that he did anything or like did the crimes. And one of the main reasons for that was the inconsistencies in any story, in all the stories. Like I said, there was anywhere between 80 and 120 victims, and that's a big gap. And I understand like record keeping wasn't the best back then, but 80 to 120 victims, that's a lot. Like that's a
And there
lot
are
to get.
some side stories that said it could have been even up to 200 victims. So, why
Yeah,
is
and
there such a
that's
wide gap in the number of potential victims? And the crazy part is that even without any of his crimes being published, or even if he had never been a criminal, he would have still maintained his spot in history. He would have still had his name out there because of his intertwinement with Joan of Arc.
yeah.
There
So
are
he was
even to the point where some of the people who were in support of Gilles de Rais stated that they claimed that he was innocent and set up by local authorities due to his lavish lifestyle.
Yeah, so that's a big thing is that they believe that like other world or other leaders of the country, like John V and John XI, I think it is, those two really wanted him gone, right? So what they were doing is that they were paying these locals to like basically they were either paying them or torturing them to basically make up these stories of, hey, there's these kids missing. My kids went missing, whether a kid went missing or not. And they were also paying them to say, like, hey, he kept or some of his servants were getting paid to say, hey, he kept these bodies for years. But like I said earlier, his castles were public, like open to the public. Anybody could go in and look around. And considering there was no one reported anything, and keeping a body for years, it's going to start stinking. And especially back then, like,
And part of the
you
problem
would
that we
know.
see amongst all of this chatter and amongst all of the stories, the rumors that flew, and whatever the facts were or may not have been, we could consider, like I mentioned earlier, that part of the problem that some people had with him was that he may have been trying to be an openly gay man. And between the fact that he was, gay, had interest in men, and the fact that he was having an overly lavish lifestyle, which I personally feel is some type of trauma response to the issues with Joan of Arc, a lot of people currently today think that part of the issue that caused all of the drama was because he was openly gay, and that he was, in a situation where he could have been stripped of his wealth and his title due to the fact that people were jealous of him being able to be at least semi openly gay and live such a lavish lifestyle.
Yeah. So he was really popular in society. So that is I haven't really looked into that theory too much. One of the theories that I did see was that there wasn't any murders at all. That these kids, there was no kids that went missing, but he was basically he was put to this kind of mock trial, and they tortured him into admitting to a bunch of these murders that he never did. And then when he did admit to these murders, they falsely recorded how many murders he admitted to. So if they tortured him into admitting to like 3 murders, they added a zero on. Oh, congratulations, you just admitted to 30, right? So record
Which
keeping at this time, especially this was back in the 1400s, if I'm not mistaken, shortly, or no. So about 200 years later, you have the Salem witch trials, which you see where judges, especially back then, cared a lot more about their reputation than the lives of the people that they're supposed to be representing, I guess would be the word, where they know they're wrong, but they can't say they're wrong because then it puts their reputation at risk. And it makes them not want to admit to any wrongdoing.
Which you make a good point with. Record keeping, even still today in 2024, is not what it could be. There could be better
No,
systems put in place. There could be more consistency. There could be double checks. And there could be, layers of people that could have jobs to make sure that everything is recorded correctly, but it's just not done that way. And back then,
yeah,
there was no idea for a system for record keeping. There was no difference between hearsay and testimony. It was the same thing, and a lot of people in that time frame that were convicted of crimes, and we're talking all the way from like the 1400s all the way up into even like the 1800s and some parts of the early 1900s, a lot of the crimes that were tried during that period of time, convictions were made almost 100% on hearsay.
yes. Because at this point, like, we didn't have forensic evidence up until, like, at least good forensic evidence up until like the 80s and the 90s.
When we started
So
gaining things like fingerprinting, DNA
yes,
testing, and stuff like that.
yeah, and whenever they searched all of his castles, they really didn't find anything, which again, that could be chalked up to the fact that he burned the bodies. That could be chalked up to the fact that no one was
There.
ever there. So,
So tell me, Ducky, what do you think?
so I personally think he did it, right? So again, a lot of it is hearsay, but I personally think he did it due to the fact that people are twisted, and especially people who went through as much trauma as he did. PTSD wasn't a big like thought about thing yet. He could have been a very early case of that. He was kind of neglected as a child. He was forced to do some pretty messed up stuff. He spent a lot of time looking after a woman who really like he shouldn't have had to been looking over. He had a really bad spending problem, really bad alcohol problem, really bad depression problem. And I think in his downfall or in his decline, he saw it as like a way of reliving his own battles, I guess. So he went out and killed all these people, and it just felt so natural to him that he continued to do it. And he chose kids because they're pretty low ranking members of society. No one really, at this point, no one really cared if they went missing. And it's really hard to track them because they don't really at this point in time they didn't really serve any purpose, I guess you could say, in quotation marks. Like obviously people cared for their kids. I'm not saying that they were useless, but at this point, like, kids weren't going to school all the time. They were really just farmhands, is what it seemed like, at least from the research I did. What about you? What do you think?
So I have a little bit of on the fence issue going on. So I feel like there is enough evidence to support that some murders may have been committed at some point. I can't say beyond a shadow of a doubt that I believe that he's guilty. I also wonder, like you said, we didn't really have mental health back then. Mental health was not a thing in the 1400s. So the trauma that he experienced as a young boy, the trauma that he experienced as a young man, the trauma of being a soldier, there was so much trauma in this man's life, his very short life, that I feel like begin to wonder whether or not some of the things that he confessed to or admitted to, or some of the things that he was alleged to be a part of, could have been some type of, I guess you would call it like maybe a dementia type of thing, where it was some type of delusion that other people were playing into to try to placate his mental health struggles. Because back then, he only would have been seen as mad. They didn't have any answers to what mad was, or whether there was a cause for being mad, or whether there was a cure for being mad. They just would have noticed him as crazy. They would have noted him as crazy. And these people, even the supporters of him at that point, if they're just noting him as crazy and they're playing into a delusion, the people that are around him or live with him or serve him, they're playing into this delusion that is supported by the number of supporters this man still has as such a devout Christian, which is kind of conflicting in and of itself, because he couldn't really be seen as a fully devout Christian when he was, he was kind of a little bit of a heretic, if you want to ask me, because he earlier on in his life, before all these, alleged murders and sodomies and CSAs and things of that nature, before the trial, before any of this, he was in a situation where he had that, like we said, come to Jesus moment. And he was trying to run a church by himself without any type of education or certification or acknowledgement from the diocese. So I wonder if a lot of the situation could be attributed to delusion and people around him that cared for him playing into his delusion. And then it just got so out of hand that they were like, yeah, he really did these things.
So what you're saying is like he pretty much had like a bunch of mental problems where maybe he didn't do it, but he was imagining, like basically everyone was accusing him of doing it, and it's one of those things that if you tell a lie enough times, it'll become true. So he's sitting there
Absolutely.
thinking, well, maybe I did do these things, right? Which is an absolutely great point where he went through all this trauma and he spent so much time trying to be this military man that he kind of forgot who he was along the way and how he like with his depression all that caused him to have really bad memory issues and like you said somewhat especially with how shorter lifespans were back then probably early onset like either dementia or one of the big symptoms of depression is memory loss. So maybe it's one of those things where maybe you did do this. Maybe you did it when you were blackout drunk one day. Like
Imposter
people are
syndrome,
accusing him of all
dude.
of these things. Yeah, where he's saying like, "Oh shit, maybe I did do these things," and then he just admits to it. He's like, "Well, shit, I did do it. Well, why'd you do it? My imagination told me to."
And that's exactly what leads me to believe that this whole thing could possibly be attributed to mental health struggles and people feeding into delusions, because he went from this whole thing where he was like, hey, I didn't have anything to do with this, and then he admitted it multiple times, had another come to Jesus moment and he was like, nah, I didn't do it, and then he admitted to it multiple more times, and then had acts of contrition in remorse for these things. So he could have been dealing with, like you said, that torment, that torture. We don't know what happened in those time frames that continually was changing his outlook and his outward appearance of his demeanor. We don't know what caused the changes in his demeanor because none of that was recorded. So this could be as simple as, okay, a lot of these people decided that they were jealous of me because I had money, even though I was being a kind of a jerk with my money. A lot of these people were jealous, so they made up a bunch of crap, and I'm starting to believe the bunch of crap because they keep telling me that this bunch of crap is what I did.
Which excellent point. I didn't think of it that way. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I personally still think he did it. Because I just like accusing someone of 80 to 120 different murders. Like, I feel like there's got to be at least some truth to it. Maybe he didn't kill all 80 to 120, but I feel like he definitely had something to do with some of it because I
So
feel
like
like even back then,
maybe he could be attributed to, some of the the other crimes, the molestation, the sodomy, the rapes, the poor treatment of the page boys, maybe because he was guilty of those things that led him to starting to, like we've even seen it currently in current crime, people will begin to worry that their victims of living crimes where there is no murder committed are going to start talking, and it's going to be really, really bad for them. And so then they start just killing them instead.
which is where my mind goes because I feel like even back then it would be extremely difficult to pin 80 to 120 different murders on someone. Like even
If there
today where
wasn't
we have
some
a
type
bunch
of
of evidence.
linking, if there wasn't some type of linking situation, then why would they
Yeah.
say 80 to 120 or even 200 murders?
Yeah. Like even today, even if we have evidence pointing to this person, we won't charge them with a murder if there's not absolute evidence. Obviously, the justice system has changed, and we're looking at 1400s France justice system versus modern day American uh, justice system. But still, I feel like just that's a huge number to try to pin on someone, plus the multitude of other crimes they pinned on him. And then even after that, he said, "Hey, I don't want to be burned. I want a Christian burial." And they granted that request. Makes me think that some of it had to have been real, but it does seem like a lot of it's fabricated.
That makes perfect sense as well. You make a very good point there, because why would he get to a point like, I understand, like I was just mentioning, like, after so many times of telling a lie it becomes the truth. But at the same time, why would he then profess all this different crime if there wasn't at least truth to part of what he was confessing?
Yes. Yeah. So like you said, it's a little bit on the fence. I lean a little bit more towards he did do it because it's just there's a lot there. In his story, there's a lot to unpack, and really how much of it's true, how much of it's false, kind of kind of weird. But I do think that it's a lot of up to speculation.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, we don't have a time machine, so it's not like we can go back and find out the
Yeah.
things that were actually being discussed or the evidence that was actually being presented in the trial, so that we can make a better informed decision on how we feel either way. But I feel like I said, I'm on the fence. You may be right. I might be right. We'll never know for
Very well.
100% because there just wasn't the justice system in place that would have been able to give more information, and the record keeping was just so completely lax that we don't even have enough information to make a fully informed decision on how we feel one way or the other and be beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Yes, but he did start the whole whether or not he did it or he didn't do it, he did start the whole trend through history of mass murdering just for the hell of it, is what it
Which
seems
leads
like.
us to a very interesting thing to mention now as we come to the end of recording today. We are looking at the possibility of, at this point, every other week delving into somebody's life of crime. There's
Yes.
a lot of crime out there for us to delve into. And I feel like we should ask whoever's listening if they would like to submit a crime or a criminal that they'd like to hear us discuss more in detail like this, as well as give us their opinions on what they think. Did he or didn't he do it?
Absolutely. All opinions are welcome. So as of right now, the next scheduled crime,
Abu Ghraib, torture and prisoner
yes,
abuse, is what's going to be
that
our
is
next episode.
yes, that's currently the next one. That is a little bit more modern history. It happened back in like 2001 to 2005. But if we get a different suggestion that someone else would like to see, more than welcome to change it. But that is just currently what we're looking into next.
Although I do feel like we could be doing great going back and forth between way back in the past and semi current past. And we want to hear all kinds chime in on this and tell us, do you want to hear about something that's well known? Us give the facts and then our opinions on it and then ask for yours. Or do you want to hear about something that you might never have heard of before?
Yes, open to all comments, good, bad, constructive criticism. It's all going to be taken into account. So with that, I think we are to the end.
Well, that says it. I guess I'm your host, Orion,
I'm your host, Ducky,
and this has
and
been
this was the
Delayeds
Delayed After
After
Dark.
Dark.